Causes of the Revolution Study Guide. Mercantilism is an economic system that bases a nation's wealth and power on the amount of gold and silver in its treasury. In the 1650s, English passed a series of laws called the Navigation Acts. Their sole purpose was to limit the trade of the colonies to England. Colonists had to send their goods to England on English ships that were sailed by English soldiers, and they were not allowed to negotiate trade agreements with other countries, even if they could have gotten a better price for them. The French and Indian War was a war between the British and the French that started in Europe and expanded to the colonies. The colonists fought for the British. The Native Americans, except for the Iroquois, fought for the French. The British won, and they received all the lands east of the Mississippi River, except the city of New Orleans, which France maintained control of because they needed to be able to send their goods down the Mississippi River to the port at New Orleans to get it on the ships to send it to Europe. One of the problems the colonists had after the war was that England would not allow them to settle the land they had just helped win. All that land west of the Appalachian mountain ranges was off limits to them. In addition, the colonists were being taxed to pay for the costs of this war. The Proclamation of 1763 was that law that prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains in that Ohio Valley. They also brought in 10,000 British troops to keep the settlers out of the Ohio Valley. In addition, the soldiers were to find any settlers currently living in the valley and send them back east of the Appalachians. According to England, this was to avoid any more conflicts with the Native Americans. They had just fought a war with them, and they didn't want any more battles going on because they frankly couldn't afford to fight them. The colonists were also being taxed to help pay for these soldiers, as well as the costs and the debt from the French and Indian War. Another act passed to raise money for England was the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act actually lowered the tax on imported molasses. It made it cheaper than what you could buy in the colonies. This meant that the colonists were being hurt in their businesses because the imported molasses was now less expensive than what they were making. The next act passed was called the Stamp Act. This was a tax on paper products. There were like over 70 some odd of them that were being taxed. The colonists were required to buy a stamp anytime they purchased a paper product like newspapers, books, playing cards, had wills made, pamphlets, even dice. I don't know how they got that in there with paper products, but even dice were being taxed. And the people were really upset because this is stuff they used every single day. So the people protested, and eventually Parliament did repeal the Stamp Act. But they turned right around and passed the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts imposed a tax on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Most of these are goods that had to be imported to the colonies because they didn't have the ability to make some of this stuff themselves. And tea? You do not mess with an Englishman's tea. It's like messing with an American Starbucks. You don't mess with their coffee. Well, the same thing applied in the colonies, only it related to tea. The people were so upset that they started protesting. There were soldiers strolling through the streets in order to keep order because of all the protests. People met, they passed letters through committees of correspondence sharing information among the colonies. And one day, everything got out of control in Boston, and it led to something called the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was actually an encounter between the British troops and the citizens of Boston. Now, these citizens had been calling the soldiers names like Lobsterback because of the red coats they wore. They had been throwing sticks at them. They'd been throwing snowballs at them. They'd been basically annoying and antagonizing them for quite a while. Well, this day, it kind of escalated. The belief is that some of those snowballs had rocks in them, and that one of these snowballs with rocks hit one of the soldiers, and he lost his temper and fired. When he fired into the crowd, so did the rest of the soldiers. When the smoke cleared, there were 5 colonists dead. Well, this was the perfect opportunity for the Sons of Liberty and the other rebels to spread some propaganda. So they asked Paul Revere to create a silver etching of the Boston Massacre. In it, he shows a picture of the English soldiers basically being ordered to fire into an innocent, unarmed crowd. This engraving was put in all the newspapers and all the colonies. Above it was the heading of the Boston Massacre, and there's coffins going across the top of the newspaper talking about all the colonists that were killed for no reason by these evil British soldiers. And propaganda, remember, is an exaggeration of the real event. Sometimes it's a downright lie in order to convince people to join your side of an argument, or in this case, a cause. And it was used to try to inspire more people to turn against England and join the revolutionaries. After all of the problems from the Boston Massacre, most of the Townshend Acts were repealed, but the Tea Act of 1773 was not. The Tea Act permitted the British East India Tea Company to sell their tea at a lower price than the colonial teas. That meant again that they were taking money away from the colonists that were selling their own tea. And this meant that while the tea was less expensive, it also was resented by the colonists. So the colonists decided to do something called boycott. They simply refused to buy the tea. It reached the point where they started refusing to unload the tea from the ships when it came into the harbor. And one night, the Sons of Liberty decided to hold their own little tea party in rebellion against the Tea Act. So they went on board a ship that had just come into the harbor a few days earlier, loaded down with tea. Remember, tea was tea leaves, like coffee. It was loose. It wasn't like tea bags we have today. So the colonists, dressed up like Indians, went on board the ship, broke open these boxes of tea, and dumped them into Boston Harbor. So Boston Harbor essentially became one big glass of tea. Then they ran away. Well, you can imagine how angry England was, not at just the loss of the tea, but at the loss of the revenue, the money they would have made from selling that tea. In retaliation for the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. They said they were intolerable. We could not live with these. Some of the actions of the Coercive Act were to close down state legislatures, close Boston Harbor, and pass the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act required colonists to provide shelter and supplies to British troops, up to and including even some people being required to house soldiers in their private homes. The colonists really resented this, so much so that when we passed our Constitution, the Third Amendment in the Bill of Rights is no quartering of soldiers. We were going to make sure this never happened again. And these are some of the events that led to the Revolutionary War.